guys, so it is that time of year again, the end of the year, the end of 2017, in which I share with you my favourite books I have read in the year of 2017. Pretty standard, this comes around every year. It isn't necessarily books that came out in 2017, simply books I read in 2017, and nor is it a specific number. It's not my top 10 or my top 17, it's completely arbitrary, solely based on the books that I really feel deserve an extra push. And if you have any Christmas money lying around and you're looking for some books to buy, these would be the ones I would say go out, check out. These are must reads. Read them in 2018, I adored them. So without further ado, let's get into the books, shall we? So I'm going to start with a book which, if you asked me what my favourite novel of the year was, I might actually say this one, although I hate to play favourites, but I think it stands out for a multitude of different reasons and would appeal to so many different readers, and it was a book that took me by surprise. And that is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. This book was shortlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. I think it should have won, but I am biased for I loved this book. I was intrigued when I picked this up. It sounded like an intriguing premise. I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, but it blew me away. It is set in 1980s Nigeria and it follows predominantly our protagonist Yejide, a woman in Nigeria, and her husband. They have decided to live a monogamous marriage despite multiple wives being common where they are. However, over the years, Yejide has yet to get pregnant. Their marriage has not resulted in a pregnancy, and because of this, her husband has been pressured by his family to take a second wife, and it is there that pretty much the story begins, and from there that things start to unravel and travel in directions you really aren't expecting them to. That sounds like, yeah, standard premise. You think you know where this book is going. It is constantly twisting and turning. You think it's going one way, it's going a way you didn't even consider it might go, and it takes you by surprise. Amidst this, you've completely fallen in love with the characters, particularly Yejide, but all of the characters in this book are incredibly fascinating. But I have to say, Yejide is possibly one of my favourite fictional characters that I've read about this year. I adored her and I adored reading about her and her life, and again all the twists and turns that it took. I sped through this book. I need more novels by this author, and I would just say anybody should read this. I think almost anybody would enjoy it because it's just such a well done novel. It is really, really well done. It is so well crafted. It just really, really has you enraptured. It pulls at your heartstrings, and I think it's just something that everybody should read. The next book I have on my pile is actually a young adult book. It's one of the 2 young adult books that have made it into my 2017 favourites. This one being A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. This is the first in a young adult trilogy, which I have seen people talk about for years. It is not a recent release, and it's something I have seen talked about on YouTube since I first started making videos about books, but I know it's been around for a lot longer than that, and people love this series. I never really thought it would necessarily be something I fell in love with. It was in the back of my mind as a book I'd noticed and thought maybe that would be interesting. But gosh, am I so happy that I finally picked this up, because when I read this book I just completely fell in love and then sped through the entire trilogy. I could not put it down. The premise is that we are in 1890 London, and our protagonist is a teenage girl who has grown up in India with her family, but now that her mother has passed away, she is to be sent to a girls' finishing school just outside of London. This is her first experience of living in England, of being at a finishing school, of so many different layers of society at the time, and there's a lot of expectations of young women of a certain class and how they should behave at this time. So it's about her getting to grips with all of that she's not necessarily as familiar with, making new friends, meeting people for the first time, and also all of the things that are happening to your body at that age, and for our main character, first sort of sexual awakenings and experiences of attraction to the opposite sex in our protagonist's case, and all of those different relationships. And I think it's such a powerful feminist novel, actually. I really feel that this is quite a feminist young adult story. It's also, I realise I've not mentioned until this point, a fantasy novel. So not only is it a period novel, it is a fantasy novel. It involves travelling to magical realms in the vein of something like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Our protagonist is also discovering that she can go to this magical realm. But at the same time, this fantasy element very much stands in for freedom and sort of the restrictions placed on women in this period in the 1890s in England, how they're very much restricted to what they can do. They really have no freedom outside of the men in their family. They can't make decisions for themselves, and this fantasy magical world allows them this freedom that they cannot get in the real world, and it is magical. Loved it, loved the characters. Yeah, what can I say? I love all of the books in this video, but yeah, brilliant series. Whilst we're on the topic of period fantasy novels, I'm going to mention my next book, and that is Hearthstone by L. Catherine White. This is such a unique concept for a book. I just could not read it when I found it in the bookshop with my friend Jill. It is a retelling of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice with dragons. And if you know me, I love dragons. A book has a dragon in it, I'm going to read it. I am there. So excited, and when I found out that there was a retelling of Pride and Prejudice with dragons, I couldn't not read it. So it's very much like the society of Jane Austen's novels in the early 1800s, except the kind of upper classes also are dragon riders and kind of protect their communities with their dragons, or well, they're paid to protect people with their dragons, and it follows the standard plot of Pride and Prejudice with a few twists and turns, some twists on the original that I really liked in where the plot went and how the characters behaved and kind of how things unravelled. Really loved those. I thought it was also a really well done fantasy retelling in that it wasn't just here, let's dump some dragons in Pride and Prejudice. The author really structured the book according to this fantasy world that she'd clearly built up a lot of folklore and history behind, so that it all made sense and it worked, and that's what matters with a fantasy novel. You really have to put that work in, even if it's not all shown in the text, and I really believe the author did that. And I really liked learning about this fantasy period world, even if the bare bones of the plot were familiar to me. So I think if you like Jane Austen and you like fantasy novels, or if you just generally like a period fantasy novel, this is one you should definitely check out, and I am so hoping that the author brings out similar books to this in the future, even perhaps a book like this set in this time period with the dragons, but a whole new plot that I am not going to know some of the elements of. Next up, I'm going to go for some non-fiction to shake it up a little bit, and the first non-fiction book I want to mention to you in this video is Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class by Owen Jones. I've mentioned Owen Jones's books in videos before where I've talked about my favourite books of the year or favourite non-fiction books, having really enjoyed his other book, The Establishment, in the past. Chavs actually came out before The Establishment, and I've been meaning to read it for years, so when I saw that it was out on audiobook in 2017, I had to finally, you know, dedicate the time to listening to it, and I'm so glad that I did. I think I enjoyed this one even more than I enjoyed The Establishment, although they're both great books. It is, like I mentioned, non-fiction. It deals with, well, the subtitle, the demonisation of the working class. In the UK, the word chavs is a word that very much has its origins in a derogatory name for people of working class backgrounds. This book is very much both about the way the working classes in the UK have suffered at the hands of consecutive governments over the past few decades, as well as have been caricatured and vilified in the media, and how this has overall kind of affected people's attitude to the class system, and identifying as working class, and looking down on people who are working class, or you know, creating this really narrow offensive perception of a lot of people. And it's something I feel very strongly about, coming from a working class background, and it's something that I think this book did a really excellent job at exploring. I think classism is something people really need to continue to talk about, as it's still incredibly prevalent today. I think it's incredibly relevant today in the UK and outside of the UK. And for that reason, I would say everyone should go out and read this book. I think Owen Jones's books are very well written, make for very good reading. They really get you thinking, they engage you in a discussion. You don't have to agree with every single sentence in his books, but obviously overall I very much agreed with this book, and felt like it was a very important topic, and I would encourage all of you to go and read it. But whilst we're on the topic of non-fiction, let's talk about another non-fiction book that I listened to on audiobook this year, and that is Juno Dawson's The Gender Games. Juno Dawson is an author predominantly of young adult literature who went through a transition in the past couple of years to become a woman, although she was always a woman, but she went through the transition to change certain aspects of her body and have society acknowledge her as a woman, whereas previously they had seen her as a man. This book is both Juno's journey and experience of realising that she was a trans woman, of going through her transition, of her journey generally as a person in society and experiences in life, and general observations on gender and how gender and the gender constructs and gender confines and the way we define gender really affects everybody in society, whether you identify as male, female or neither, how very much the way we're brought up in such a gendered society has a massive impact on everybody, and the way society is constructed and how we live our lives and how it affects us. And it is such a wonderful book. It's incredibly accessible. It's one I would highly recommend you all read or listen to, especially if you've really not had any experience of this topic, but even if you have, it's a very important own voices story of somebody who's had a vast experience of living and being acknowledged as different genders and how people treat you differently. And it's just a wonderful book. But next up, I'm going to mention some poetry before we get back to some novels, and the first one I have here is You Sad Feminist by Megan Beach. This is my second collection of Megan Beach's poetry. Well, it's her second published collection of poetry. The first one being When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard, and I also love that one. I can't decide whether I love this one more or not, but I certainly love it equally, if not some of the poems in here being my favourites. I feel like my favourite poem is still When I Grow Up I Want to Be Mary Beard. That one's just ingrained in my mind, a classicist, intellectually revered, but there are some spectacular poems in here. In fact, they're all great. I love this collection. This one deals with both feminism and depression. I would say those are the two major topics, and the intersections between activism and experiencing depression, and how to continue to be an activist whilst struggling with your mental health, how to take care of yourself but also feel empowered and inspired to keep going out there and make a difference. I've said it before, I feel like reading this collection of poetry is like sitting down with an incredibly inspirational friend who will tell you that it's okay to feel like crap, and let's be in this together, like let's be activists together and we can keep going and, you know, change the world and take care of one another. And I just loved every word in this book. I found it so empowering, like I said, inspiring, comforting from all angles. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and I think it's a collection of poetry that, again, everyone should read. What am I supposed to say in my favourite books of the year? Everyone should read all of these books, obviously, but I adored this, and if you haven't checked out Megan Beach's poetry, I would highly recommend at least picking up this or her other collection, because she's just great. Her poetry has a beautiful rhythm. It definitely benefits from being read out loud. It's a pleasure to wrap your tongue around, and I think for people at all levels of poetry, whether you feel poetry is incredibly daunting and you are averse from checking it out, or you're already a massive poetry fan, this is for you. But on the topic of amazing poetry collections, another poetry collection I read this year, right at the beginning of the year, and fell in love with was Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. This book very much deals with racism. It deals with a broad spectrum of everyday experiences of racism, from casual racism, little statements people make towards you, or ways people treat people who are not white just on public transport or in a shop, all the way up to extreme violence towards people who are not white. So a really broad spectrum there, from the author's experiences to the experiences of people like Serena Williams and the way they've been treated by other tennis players in the media, and the way people are talked about who aren't white. And it's an incredibly harrowing but visceral poetry collection. These are words that refuse not to be heard. They make you listen, and they are incredibly strong and powerful poems that I, again, could not recommend more highly. And I have another one of Claudia Rankine's poetry collections waiting for me to be read, because I just think she has an amazing way with words. She knows what she is doing and she says incredibly powerful things with those words, so would highly recommend checking out Citizen. But whilst on topic of beautiful words, I have a collection of short stories, and that is The Doll's Alphabet by Kamila Grudova. These short stories are magical realism, I would say. Yeah, there's a lot of magical realism themes in here. They're quite surreal. They often make you challenge what you find believable, and you have to really think and adjust your perceptions, and and doing all that really has you thinking whilst you're reading these stories. I think they're incredibly thought-provoking stories whilst being incredibly magical, surreal and stunningly written. I just think the author's prose are out of this world. I really just fell in love with these stories. I particularly loved Unstitching and Waxy, but they all really struck a chord with me, and I loved reading this collection. I just found it was a collection of short stories that I couldn't put down. Once I'd finished one story, I wanted to read another one, and then that was over and I wanted to read another one, so it was a very quick reading experience. It's one that I would certainly go back and reread particular stories of, if not the whole collection. And there was lots of reoccurring images throughout the stories that would come back up again and really tied the whole collection together, and that was a really nice thing to observe throughout. So adored this collection. But to return to a novel, for those of you that are particularly looking for novels, another novel I loved in 2017 was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a dystopian novel, predominantly following our three protagonists, a young man and two young women who have grown up together in a school since they were very young, right throughout their teen years, in which they are all being raised alongside other children, completely parentless, for a certain purpose. Now initially you don't know what this purpose is, but you gradually learn what they are destined for throughout the novel. It's not like a big reveal at the end, clues are dropped and you know by the halfway point. It's not necessarily about finding out why they're there, it's about witnessing their interactions with one another, their relationships, their experiences of humanity and being humans and what that means and who they are, and the way your life changes when your future is determined in this way. And I obviously don't want to give away what the spoiler is, but it's such a beautifully written, thoughtful novel, and I loved reading about these characters' relationships. You don't always like them, sometimes you hate them, but other times you completely relate to them. They are such real characters, they are so layered and wonderfully constructed by the author that I just thought the whole book was wonderfully constructed. In fact, all of it just really ties together, and it's this lovely like zoomed in view of a few people's experience of this strange dystopian world, and it's one that has obviously had a lot of praise. There's a film being made out of it, and I think it's so well deserved. The author actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017, so I'm glad I finally read one of his books. Now that that's happened, I now understand the wonder that is Kazuo Ishiguro, and if you don't yet either, then Never Let Me Go is a perfect place to start, and I would highly recommend it to everyone. Let's go back to the other young adult book of 2017 that really stayed with me, and that is The Fallen Children by David Owen. This book is actually a retelling, again actually another retelling of a classic novel. This time it's a retelling of John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos, which is a classic science fiction novel from the 1950s or 60s that I love. I love The Midwich Cuckoos. I think it's such a fun concept. I love John Wyndham's books in general, and that was the first one I ever read by him. So when I heard there was this young adult retelling, I had to check it out. Now, the concept of The Fallen Children is that a bunch of young women in a council estate in London wake up one morning to find themselves pregnant, which is very similar to The Midwich Cuckoos, in which a small village falls asleep for one night, and when they wake up, all of the women are pregnant. In this instance, it's only the women in this council block of a certain age, but you know, same premise. Something has happened that has left them all pregnant. Like I said, it's a science fiction novel, so I think you already know there's some sort of scientific or extraterrestrial reason for this happening. And what I loved about this novel was that it really dealt with some of the things that were missing for me from The Midwich Cuckoos, is that it's told from both the perspective of the girls that get pregnant as well as one of the girls' on and off, again, boyfriend. And what is so important about that is that you are getting the female perspective, the perspective of the people who are actually pregnant, as opposed to John Wyndham's novel. You know, how harrowing and how difficult that is for them, or how it affects them all differently, in fact. This surprise pregnancy, how it affects their lives, their relationships with their families, this violation of their body, because this is a pregnancy they did not consent to, and really what's going through their mind. And I loved that. I thought it was an incredibly important way to retell the story in a modern setting, because it tackled modern themes. It dealt with classism, actually, again, because it very much dealt with the way that young people are being left behind by the current government in the UK, kind of their futures and how much of a struggle it is for them. Again, that violation of their bodies, and so many relevant themes explored in a young adult science fiction novel, and I thought it was so cleverly done. So well done. I absolutely loved it. Unique concept, could have gone wrong, could have gone right, very much went right in my opinion. And although a science fiction novel, one that very much deals with real themes, and real themes that affect young people. So I thought, yeah, really well done, David Owen. Two more books though. I have another poetry collection and another non-fiction book. So let's go for the non-fiction book first, and that is What is Economics by Rosa Luxemburg. Now the one problem with this book is it's actually out of print, but you can read what's in this little volume in bind-ups of Rosa Luxemburg's general economic works. So again, like I've mentioned in previous videos, I will always link something down below that it contains this text. Now this was the first time I'd read any Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg was an activist and an academic in the late 18 and early 1900s. She was born from Poland but left the country at a very young age, went to one of the few universities in Europe that was taking female students, ended up in Germany where her life ended when she was murdered by a far-right group after World War I. And she wrote a lot while she was alive. This book, like the title suggests, explores what is economics. It looks at the concept of the science of economics, what it is for, what does it examine, what does it study. If you're studying economics, what are you studying? She very much looks at earlier and contemporary definitions by economists and tears them apart. She throws so much academic shade in this book. She highlights how incomprehensible their definitions are. She questions their lack of clarity and why they feel they need to avoid that clarity, what they're actually trying to achieve with this very exclusionary academic language that really does nothing, what purpose does it serve, and you know, explores it all in a really interesting way. She talks about economics of her day, which obviously are more of historical interest than they are of current interest to us, but she also talks a lot about economics in a wider sense, which I think is still very relevant to today, and this book is not irrelevant despite having come out about 100 years ago. But like I mentioned, one of my favourite things about it was her writing style, her academic shade, her witticisms. She was such a clever writer, and she's someone that is now a great inspiration for me as an academic writer, because I too kind of hate pompous, incomprehensible academic writing, and I just thought this book was wonderful. It has made me want to read so much more Rosa Luxemburg, learn so much more about her as a political activist and a woman and an academic, and I have already bought some books on her life that I'm going to be reading soon, and I've just completely fallen in love. She's brilliant, this book was brilliant, her writing is brilliant. But last but certainly not least, I did mention there was one last collection of poetry, and this collection of poetry is actually an anthology. It is called Furies, an anthology of women warriors. Now these are a vast array of feminist poems from different poets. Given the vast array of voices that you get in this poetry collection, you obviously get a vast array of styles of poetry. Despite this, and I think something that can happen a lot with anthologies is that there can be a lot of hit and misses in there, I loved almost all the poems in here. There were so many that I adored and poets that I now want to read more by, others that I enjoyed, and very few that I did not like. So this was a really standout anthology for me, and I thought despite the fact that it was from loads of different poets, it really came together as a whole. It did not feel really disparate and disjointed. It felt like a complete collection of poems that really stood well beside one another. It was these beautiful feminist voices, different voices that, you know, tied together and said something separately and together, and it was really beautiful and empowering and inspirational to read. Feminism is obviously the overarching theme, and I think that's all you really need to go into it with, and you will discover the exploration of so many different topics through poetry. And I think if you're looking to get into poetry again, it's one worth checking out, because you might discover some poets that write in a style that really resonates with you, and I adored this collection. But I adored every book in this video, as I'm sure you've been able to tell. I hope I have not rambled on for too long, and I hope you have discovered at least one book that has caught your interest and you might check out in 2018, if not a number of books. I am also looking for 2018 reads though, so if you have any favourite books that you read in 2017, please do let me know what they are in the comments down below. I would love to know. I am always interested in checking out something new, so I'd love to hear what you loved and had an impact on you in 2017. If you'd like to know some more excellent books, I will of course link my 2016 favourite books of the year video. Those I all stand by still, so you can check those out too. But I'm sure there are going to be plenty more of these 2017 favourite videos going up in your subscription feeds over the next few days, and I am looking forward to watching them all myself. So I better get editing this video so I can get watching other people's videos, and that means I better go. So until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!